Hello then, good afternoon ladies and gentlemen to our special coverage of the Ukraine fight. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has said that Russia's public image is now one of agony and execution after a retreat of Russian forces in the town of Bucha led to the discovery of the killings of hundreds of civilians. On the other side, the EU is preparing to introduce more sanctions against Moscow after reports of atrocities emerged in the wake of Russia's military retreat from the outskirts of Kiev. Charles Michel, president of the European Council, said further sanctions were on their way. To this point, one can say, is Russia really failed to reach the capital Kiev, or Russia never planned to take all of Ukraine? Are Ukraine forces succeeded to push the enemy back? Some of them says yes, others says this is another strategy from the Russian. Multiple questions needs to be answered by our panel of guests represented by Mr. Dennis Small, Ibero-American editor within the weekly strategic analysis magazine found by Lyndon LaRouche from Virginia, USA, and Ruslan Bortnik, director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics from Kiev, from Ukraine. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve in our discussion, this is the latest update in Ukraine. Russia orders an official examination of what is called Ukraine's provocation after Kiev accused the Russian military of massacring civilians in Bucha. Antonio Guterres says he was deeply shocked by images of dead civilians in the Ukrainian town of Bucha and calls for an independent investigation. Germany's defense minister said that the EU should consider cutting off Russian fuel, a move that leaders have refused to do so far. Russia appeared to be regrouping to fight in the south and the east. Now moving on to our panel of guests. Mr. Dennis, since this is your first intervention with us, I would love to know what is your interpretation for this military operation in Ukraine by Russians, and was this operation the only way for Russia to defend its national security as it claimed?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on to this discussion, this panel discussion. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of these developments with you. I think the first and most important thing is to put this in the proper context, the historical perspective. The immediate reports from Ukraine, this is war reporting, it's war news. It is almost impossible to tell what's actually happening on the ground. However, if you take a step back and look at the context and look at the cui bono, who is to benefit, certain things need to be said. The Russians had been warning for a decade or more that if NATO kept expanding eastward up to the very borders of Russia, this presented an existential threat to the existence of the Russian nation. Russia warned repeatedly, beginning in the 2007 speech at the Munich conference by President Putin, that a different order was possible and necessary internationally, that NATO could not keep expanding forward. Russia had received promises repeatedly from the United States, and through the words of James Baker III, this is now well documented, that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. NATO moved not 1 inch, but 1,000 kilometers to the east, to the point where NATO was about to expand into Ukraine with the announcement by both NATO and Ukraine that that was their intention. And Russia warned repeatedly that the only choice they would have would be to take measures to prevent this. Now, one can object to what is going on, and certainly many of the scenes are horrible, whoever is responsible. But the strategic fact of the matter is that this crisis has been caused by the NATO expansion eastward, the destruction of the economies of the entire transatlantic sector by the International Monetary Fund, by Wall Street banks, by the City of London banks, which is driving the force towards war. And what we in the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement have been saying repeatedly is that we need an entirely new international security and development architecture to pull the world back from the brink of war. And we will be holding a conference this coming Saturday, April 9th, to discuss exactly those issues, the solutions to the problem at hand.
Understood. Mr. Ruslan from Ukraine, are you with us in this intervention?
Yes, I am, colleagues.
Perfect. Mr. Ruslan, I'll be talking to you. You are in Kiev. What can you tell us about the latest over there?
We see some kind of normalization in Kiev and around of Kiev because there is no more Russian troops on the Kiev near the Kiev, and no Russian troops we are trying to attend to Kiev. And we see the normalization of social economical life and humanitarian situation. Many people come back to Kiev after their so-called vacation in the western regions of Ukraine. But at the same time, people are very stressed and afraid, a lot of scare and aggression. Many block points, checkpoints on the streets, and of course we take more and more information about the different type of war crimes which were made near the Kiev in the territory which were under the Russian control.
Okay, Mr. Ruslan, as a direct question, do you think that the Russian troops withdrawing is a sign of success for Ukrainians?
This even Wikipedia thinks so, even Russian-speaking Wikipedia. But to be honest, we understand that the first plan of Russia it was to push Ukrainian government to capitulation through the interventions from three sides, from the north, south, and east of Ukraine. This plan was broken, but Russia has more plans, much more plans, and nowadays we see these Russian the troops which were not successful around the Kiev are moving to the east of Ukraine, and the next few days we are waiting for a big battle in the Donbass and in the south of Ukraine.
Quite understood. Moving on to the second point, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian leaders are responsible for killings of civilians in Bucha outside Kiev, where bodies were found lying in the streets after the city was taken over by Ukrainian forces. Hussein Burkan on follow.
Corpses everywhere in the Ukrainian city of Bucha, northwest of Kiev, where residents continue to mourn their dead after the withdrawal of Russian soldiers. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russian leaders should be held responsible for murders and tortures in Bucha, where horrific findings have sparked outrage in Europe and the US.
I call on all our citizens and friends of Ukraine around the world who can join in this work and help establish justice to do so. The world has already seen many war crimes at different times on a different continent. But it is time to do everything in our power to make the war crimes of the Russian military the latest manifestation of such evil on earth.
In turn, Dmitry Kuleba, Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, said that what happened in Bucha and vicinities is worse than ISIS.
Bucha massacre is the most outrageous atrocity of the 21st century. Without an exaggeration, by what we've seen in Bucha and vicinity, we can conclude that Russia is worse than ISIS in the scale and the ruthlessness of the crimes committed.
During a visit in the liberated suburb of Kiev, the mayor of the Ukrainian capital, Vitaly Kilochiki, declares that the aggressor must pay the price.
It's genocide of Ukrainian population. More than sure, is that people in Russia and the Russian government have to pay for that painful price.
After more than a month since the start of the Russian operation in Ukraine, scores of civilians have lost their lives in the conflict. Armies of both countries have been involved in intense fights since Russian troops entered Ukraine.
Mr. Ruslan, coming back to you, based on this report and the information you already know as a Ukrainian, do you strongly believe that this is Russian-made? I mean, the killings of the civilians occurred on purpose, or it was another collateral damage of the shelling?
Of course, I don't know, and I hope the International Commission should research these crimes, because more than 400 people for this moment were found killed in this territory which were under the Russian control. Of course, many of them were killed by artillery, but there are also many people which are wounded by machine guns, which are stretched the hands, which has the marks of very, very bad behavior for these people. And this is the big war crimes, the first big war crimes in this situation. In Ukrainian-Russian war, and only international commission should resolve it and should make decisions. But in any case, we should remember that about the political results of these crimes, because these crimes is a reason for a new wave of sanctions to the Russia, and these crimes will lead to more aggressive society opinion in Ukraine, to more aggressive war between Ukraine and Russia.
Mr. Denis, how the wars media produce, and especially the Western one over this military operation in Ukraine, don't you think that there is a sort of exaggeration?
Well, this is war propaganda. We're in a war, and any responsible journalism tells both sides of the story, but tries to look behind the scenes to see what's actually going on. For example, I was reading earlier yesterday that the Defense Ministry of Russia put out a statement not only denying their responsibility, but producing certain evidence around this. One should also refer to what is well known in the past of so-called false flag operations, the role of groups such as the White Helmets in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere in staging these kinds of atrocities for mass media consumption. I don't know if the Russian report is true, and I don't know if the Ukrainian report is true. What I do know is that the intention of the Wall Street and the City of London world financial system has been to provoke a showdown up to and including a nuclear war with Russia and China, because under these conditions of global financial collapse, any alternative to the collapsing Western financial system is considered a danger to those interests.
Sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. Denis. What is happening now in Ukraine happened before in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and still happening in Palestine every day. But no one talk about that. Why these double standards from the West?
For exactly the reason I said. The double standard is intended to push a strategic agenda. The hypocrisy is clear. I mean, for example, I have to smile when I listen to Mr. Kuleba saying that what happened is worse than ISIS. One of the top advisors to the Defense Ministry of Ukraine is none other than Dmytros Yarosh, the head of the right sector of Ukraine, who is an international terrorist. He is a neo-Nazi. He is a supporter of Stepan Bandera, the ally of Adolf Hitler in World War II. And Mr. Yarosh was involved in fighting with the Chechens against Russia, committing the atrocities in that country. So a certain amount of hypocrisy and double standard is rather obvious. But again, the question is, why is this actually occurring? You mentioned Libya, you mentioned Syria. When the absolutely unacceptable invasion of Libya and assassination of Gaddafi occurred, the head of my organization, Lyndon LaRouche, at that time, over a decade ago, said the strategic purpose of this is to launch a war against Russia and China, because Russia and China are a threat to the kind of global economic collapse which the City of London and Wall Street
Perfectly
are
understood.
heading at this point. That's the actual agenda of Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Moving on to the second point, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said in an interview with CBC News, U.S. program Face the Nation, that what's happening is a genocide, and that is about the extermination of a whole nation. Zelensky added that this should not be happening in the 21st century of Europe.
Indeed, it's genocide, the elimination of an entire nation and an entire people. We are the people of Ukraine. We have more than 100 nationalities. It is about the destruction and extermination of all these nationalities. We are the citizens of Ukraine, and we don't want to be subject to Russian politics. This is the reason why we are destroyed and exterminated, and this is happening in the 21st century Europe. So it's the charter of the whole nation.
Mr. Denis, Vladimir Zelensky, from the beginning of this conflict, he kept saying that Russia is committing genocide in his country, even though there were some reports claimed Ukrainian soldiers are doing the same to anyone against the state. How can you explain these words? Is he trying to picture Russia as the world evil, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole world?
Well, let's remember, Zelensky is an actor. He's a comic and an actor, and he is being given lines to read. The people providing those lines to Mr. Zelensky are two public relations firms in London who are working with Ukrainians to craft the message coming from Zelensky, which is largely directed to the West. And again, this is war propaganda run out of London and Washington to create an effect. Now, if you want to talk about genocide, the real genocide here is the result of the sanctions which are now being implemented using Ukraine as an excuse. You have a situation where, according to numerous responsible economists, what was expected to be 230 million deaths by starvation worldwide is now going to be approximately 1 billion deaths by starvation. Russia and Ukraine are major producers of wheat and other food. They have stopped exporting because of the war situation. The big people who are going to be paying the price for this are people in the Middle East and North Africa, which are 70% dependent on Russian and Ukrainian wheat for their survival. What is going to happen even in Europe? The sanctions are completely suicidal by Europe's side. Germany depends on Russia, on gas and oil from Russia, for 24% of their entire energy consumption. So what's going on here is a deliberate, drastic reduction of the physical economy of the world, especially of the third world, but also of the United States and of Europe, implemented by the financial interests in the City of London and Wall Street. And they are simply using Ukraine as the latest convenient excuse to bring about a collapse which has actually been going on for 30 or 40 years. The crucial question here, and I really would like to center my comments on this, is that there is a solution to this crisis, but it requires a completely new architecture, both in the area of security and the area of economics. We need to take the speculative bubble of $2 quadrillion, and that's a 2 followed by 15 zeros, which is purely cancerous speculative debt, put it through bankruptcy reorganization, and create a new economic system to permit the development of every nation. The model for this, as the Schiller Institute has proposed, is the Treaty of Westphalia, which after 150 years of war in Europe in the 17th century brought about a peace, but based on an entirely new economic and political structure. That's what's required today.
Quite understood. Mr. Ruslan, Mr. Denis is saying that Ukraine is being used to put sanctions over Russia and its alliance in general with China. As a Ukrainian, do you feel that really Ukraine is being used?
In any case, Ukraine hasn't intervened to Russia. We are on our land, in our sovereign territory, and Russian troops are in our territory. And when we are talking about, it means if we even talk in general side, It means that Russia has ability to make another decision on Ukrainian situation, not to use the troops, but continue to use the diplomacy, economical, informational, and political instruments. And of course, there are many problems around the world, and many of them should be resolved by the war. But at the same time, I am not agreed with my colleague that in one topic. In that topic, that we should remember that understand that the war, the big war in Ukraine, brings the globalization, world economy, and world culture, world political globalization. We see how the modern world become divided in few blocks, or even not only on two blocks. So I think this war will not resolve the economical problem. It leads only for deepen this problem. Moreover, there is a big danger that this war go outside from Eastern Europe to another regions and should obtain the nuclear forms. And it's also a big danger because Russia is ready to use this weapon when she will be losing this war. Russia is not able to lose this war. At the same time, she is not able to win this war. Very dangerous situation.
Understood. White House Chief of Staff Ron Kalyan warned that Russia's special military operation in Ukraine is far from over, despite the claim by Moscow that they are retreating from Kiev and surrounding areas. Kalyan added that there is a lot of evidence that Putin is simply taking his troops out of the northern part of the country to redeploy them to the eastern part of the country to relaunch a battle over there. Mr. Dennis, is it really true that White House chief said Russia is moving to eastern parts, but they are not over? If so, what is the main goal for the Russian troops right now?
I think the main goal for the Russian troops can be determined by the statements of Russian authorities for 10 years, not for 10 days or 10 weeks. They have repeatedly stated that they cannot allow NATO and its weapons to be within less than 5 minutes flight time from Moscow. The emplacement of the Aegis on-land defense systems, ballistic missile defense systems, which can also be used for offensive purposes, on Romanian and Polish territory, the presence of destroyers with the Aegis capability in the Black Sea, as Putin has been saying for years, will push Russia's back against the wall. And he said, we have nowhere else to go. Since NATO insisted on proceeding with that and with the idea of incorporating Ukraine into NATO, just look at a map. This is like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, only much more dangerous. When Russia had put missiles 90 miles from the United States on Cuban territory, President Kennedy and American authorities said, this is an existential threat to our nation. It must be stopped. And fortunately, there were back-channel discussions between Robert Kennedy, who President Kennedy trusted as opposed to his own State Department, and Russian authorities, and an agreement was reached to pull American missiles out of Turkey, Russian missiles out of Cuba. This is now a situation which has been building for 1 decade or more, where NATO missiles are within 5 minutes flight time from Moscow. That leaves no time for a response. And therefore, the Russians have insisted that there must be some sort of buffer. So the Russian demands, as I understand it, and this seems quite reasonable, is that Ukraine should be neutral. It should be like Austria. It should be a state which is not in NATO and not in the Russian bloc, but should be a neutral area. The thing that is also crucial is that Ukraine must be reconstructed, not only from the war damage, but from 30 years of the destruction of its economy by neoliberal economic policies. If you study the economy as we have done, you will find that beginning in 1990, not beginning in 2021, beginning in 1990, The Ukrainian population and labor force have been destroyed by these economic policies. It used to be a very rich nation, had tremendous industrial capabilities, the famous Black Earth, but the policies of Wall Street and the City of London played a major role in destroying that. Now we have to reconstruct not just Ukraine, we have to reconstruct Afghanistan, we have to reconstruct Africa, we have to reconstruct Ibero-America. The entire world is suffering from a physical economic collapse, which is going to kill millions of people. And as for what my colleague said, I think that the information he provides is very interesting in terms of Ukraine, but it is absolutely imperative to look at the bigger picture, or we will not understand what is happening on the local battlefield. Mm-hmm. This is a war that was started over 10 years ago by NATO. And what is happening in Ukraine, which is terrible and unfortunate, is the result of that NATO offensive policy. We are looking at a 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, and we should respond the way the world responded then, which is to address the underlying problem, negotiate a ceasefire, and then go for development.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Ruslan, if we take into consideration that Russian troops are moving eastward of Ukraine, is that considered as another challenge for Ukraine's army, or it will be easy to contain the enemy in one side?
At first, I want to say that Russia has the old strategic and tactical goal. The strategic goal of Russia is to obtain the world recognition as a state, one of the world leaders who has her own external interests and zone of influence. And tactical goal for Russia for nowadays is to push Ukraine for capitulation. And if it wouldn't work with situation around Kiev, Russia now is going to make this in the south of Ukraine. In the south of Ukraine, situated all Ukrainian seaports, all Ukrainian trade is going through this zone. The main part of Ukrainian natural resources like gas, coal is also in the same place. Most part of Ukrainian energetic enterprises also there are. And so it's extremely important region. Russia is going to capture all this region. This region has historical name Novorossiya. It was the name inside of Russian Empire from 18th till 20th century. And Russia is going to capture all this region and push through this situation Ukrainian government again to the capitulation or a peace agreement with Russian in Russian way.
Understood. In couple minutes left for us to come an end to this show. I have been called by the technical staff to put an end for this show. In 1 minute, Mr. Denis, what can you say about this military operation in Ukraine? What is your expectation for the coming days?
My expectation and my hope is that saner voices and minds will prevail in the West and pull back from the provocative approach of trying to trigger a thermonuclear confrontation with Russia and China. The statements coming from the White House that the intention and the goal is to destroy and wipe out Russia and to destroy and wipe out the Chinese economy is a losing strategy. We have to shift our focus. We have to have an approach where there can be not a decoupling of the world's economies, but a recoupling around a policy of economic growth and industrial development, especially of the nations of the South.
Thank you, Mr.
This will require a total change in the world financial system. And I would like to, again, invite your listeners to participate in this coming Saturday's international conference on the Ukraine situation presented by the Schiller Institute.
Thank you so much. Mr. Denis, it's such a pleasure having you in with us. Mr. Ruslan, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for this debate and for your presence. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us and have a blessed evening. Tomorrow, inshallah, we will have another special coverage. Bye-bye.